Welcome everyone to our Sustainable Finance seminar series. I'm Abigail Martin. I'm a research fellow at Stanford's Sustainable Finance Initiative in the Doerr School of Sustainability. And this is our monthly seminar series, which is a collaborative effort between SFI and our friends at KAIST in South Korea. And each month we explore a different topic in sustainable finance and investment with a guest speaker. And today we're very glad to have you all here, both on campus and globally. And we are delighted to introduce Chief Economist Eric Berglof, who will be our guest speaker today. Dr. Berglof is the inaugural Chief Economist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where he leads visioning and strategy at the Economics Department and serves as a member of the bank's executive committee. He's also the former director of the Institute of Global Affairs at LSE in the UK and former chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, where he co-led the Vienna Initiative, which mitigated the 2008 recession from a European response perspective. He has now focused on the role of infrastructure and global value chains in addressing climate and environmental problems. And he has a master's and PhD from Stockholm School of Economics. And he's also no stranger to Stanford. He's been a visiting faculty here in Stanford Economics and CIPER, and also a fellow at the Center of Advanced Studies in Behavioral Science. I'm personally very excited for Eric's talk today. Having read his draft manuscript, I can say without any spoilers that he's going to offer us a very close and interesting look at the very pressing choices that leaders face in China and India in pursuing what Eric refers to as the triad of planning, markets, and finance. I found the paper very compelling as he's giving us insights into two countries that are the role models for other emerging markets, so to speak, and putting side by side cases that elaborate on the complex tensions between different governance mechanisms in specific and unique national settings, looking at the kinds of bespoke policy mixes that governments have to develop to drive transition processes, as well as the fundamental challenges of getting these policy mixes right, so to speak, in what are very unique multi-level political contexts. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Eric, with a very brief note on agenda. Eric will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we have 10 to 15 minutes reserved for Q&A at the end. But as Eric has mentioned, he has a preference for more conversational style. So if audience members have questions or comments during Eric's talk, feel free to post them in the chat or raise a hand, and we can facilitate a more sort of conversational style that way. Okay, Eric.
Thank you, and good morning from Beijing. It's nice to be back at Stanford, if only virtually, and really look forward to this conversation. So thank you, Abigail. I guess probably you call Abby, as you tend to be in US. But so I'm what I call a recovering academic. I spent probably most of my career in academia, but recently been more involved in policy making. And the talk I'm going to give is sort of more, I guess, policymakers talk and some reflections from work we have done in China and India, and now are also doing in Brazil. So the first comment, just to before I start, is that this is really very much, I think of this as a process where we have been working with policymakers in these two countries and with think tanks and academics, and we had an international team that we worked together with, and much of this is about talking through things, and of course this end product, while hopefully meaningful and important, is not the main objective. The main objective is really to initiate and be part of conversations in these countries, and that's very much the spirit of these documents, also not trying to be too normative on the countries themselves, but more drawing lessons from what they have done. So this is actually also, I should say, the first time that this particular paper is being presented. So hopefully we'll find out whether this works or not. Yeah. So indeed, this is about China and India, but very much taking into account or wanting to draw lessons from other countries. Before I go ahead with this, I should say a little bit about AIIB. Say just a few words about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIB. So I joined this bank in 2020, in the middle of COVID. But the bank was then 5 years old. It was founded in 2015. Today it has 110 members, and the ownership is quite interesting because there's a core equity is 100 billion, and one quarter of that from China about, and one quarter Europe, and the half is the rest of the world. And it's really, for me, it's the rest of the world that's really the most interesting part of the institution. It's the fact that we are an institution that is dominated by the global South, and it's a very different kind of conversation than what I experienced when I had the same role at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is still very much a G7 controlled institution, and the countries where we operated had relatively little to say about or influence on what we actually did. And if you see what our global portfolio now is about 85%, not fully, or it's a little bit more than 85% in Asia, but it's growing elsewhere. But the largest country of operation is India, with about a quarter of our investment. And I think it speaks for itself that India, you don't push India around in these kind of organizations, and in India is a very prominent member of our board and very active. We are the largest co-financier of the World Bank and Asian Development Bank. So, of course, from the beginning, co-investment was the way to go, because we didn't have any staff, or not sufficient staff to really run our standalone projects. But this has become sort of way of operating, and something that we are pushing very much, and I think has been adopted now as a way of doing things in the broader MDB community. So the advantage with co-financing is, of course, you share risk, but you also do less, hopefully, or you recognize each other's standards, each other's processes, and that make this system more efficient. And you also maybe can later resell assets and so on if they are standardized across the institution. So co-financing is very important for us. So when it comes to climate, so our goal in our corporate strategy is to have more than 50% climate. Last year we had 65%, and we also want to be private. We have a sovereign part, and we have a private and non-sovereign part. We want the non-sovereign part to be 50% by 2030. Right now, I think it's around 34 or 35%. The final thing I want to say about AIB is that since last June, so a year ago, we have been allowed to do policy-based lending. So that's a very different kind of lending from project lending, but it's very complementary in our view, that on the one hand, we do projects across the whole spectrum of infrastructure, and a lot of it, or almost everything, is today related to climate in one way or another. And to be able to have also a tool, an instrument that you can engage on policy issues with the governments is very valuable, because, as we know, a lot of these climate investments, take renewables, for example, are very dependent on other aspects of the infrastructure, transmission lines and so on, but also, very importantly, very dependent on policies. So that, and I'm going to focus now a lot on policies, and when we started this work in that I'm referring to here in 2020, we didn't have the right to do policy-based lending, and we were not really very much focused on policy. So by initiating these studies, what we wanted to do from sort of my part of the bank was to kind of prepare us for, if we really have that ambition of being more than 50% climate finance, we really need to think about the policies and how we can engage with our countries on policy issues. So that's very much the sort of background to what I'm going to talk about now. If you have any questions on AIB now or later. So what I mean, this is obvious to all of you, but I think it is quite important to not lose sight of that this net zero transition is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge globally for all countries, but it's of course particularly a very significant challenge for those countries where the state capacity is in very short supply. So it requires a lot of coordination, across government entities, between, other institutions and the government, private sector, of course, and it requires a lot of changes to the financial system, or it relies a lot on the financial system being able to mediate some of these financial flows and so on that are needed to make this happen. And what's also very important, and it will become obvious when we start talking about China and India, that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There is sort of a best fit, and that's really what we're trying to see. So what we try to do, and maybe I'll take a step back just now again as I said, I joined AIB in 2020, and that was the year. As I joined in September, I think at the end of October, President Xi announced that China would reach net zero by 2060, and he said that they would peak by 2030. Being in Beijing, having some discussions with colleagues and some of our government counterparts, it was clear that this was not, people didn't really know what this meant and how to do it. It was like a political goal set out, but it had not very deep roots into the Chinese bureaucracy and any part of Chinese society. And we were sitting down and talking to my president, who is Chinese. He's the only Chinese in the leadership of the bank, but he was, I think, very keen to show that this relatively new institution could somehow contribute to the implementation of China's ambitious goals. I mean, I'll show you some pictures later, but what China had been trying to do is I think unprecedented in terms of trying to achieve a change in the structure and the institution of the economy. So very profound changes. So it's against that background that we tried to think of what kind of framework could we have for thinking through that process of moving from a very rapid increase in the carbon footprint of the Chinese economy to in a few decades bring it down to zero. And so that's the kind of purpose of this framework. It's of course to use the state authorities and align the different policies and institutions, enabling and crowding in the private sector, and of course doing all this, at a cost and benefit that was shared by the population in a fair and equitable way. So that's a bit the background. I don't think I need to tell you why China and India are important. They are number one and number three, and potentially over time, India could well become the number one, given the demographics. So here is some just superficial pictures of the greenhouse gas emissions, and then what the blue is the kind of policy space that you see now with given the given policies, and the green is the what is needed to achieve the Paris Agreement. These are not our estimates. These come from the Climate Action Tracker that most of you are probably familiar with. But the point of these pictures is really as to show you, what dramatic decline is necessary, or reduction is necessary for China to reach its objective. So of course here what I'm going to talk about is the implications for other countries of what we learn from China, and as we said, they're a very different starting point, and we are focusing on these three elements, these three pillars of this was we wanted to have a relatively simple framework, and I should say that we developed this simple framework together with a few international colleagues. So Bengt Holmström, you're probably familiar with, and Alain Ray, and Patrick Bolton, and it was really to have a very simple framework that would allow us to discuss with policymakers. And of course, the kind of things that you worry about is that there are these very important differences in state capacity and institutional effectiveness across countries. And there are within countries, governance structures in individual sectors that overlap and create inefficiencies. And there's, of course, a difference also between the national level and the local or regional level. And that's something that, depending on the sort of country's structure, this is going to matter a great deal. So I think these three pillars now: planning, markets, financial governance. So financial governance maybe is one that requires just a few more words. So here we are really thinking about how you can use the financial system as a driver of the net zero transition, how you can set up scenarios for the financial sector, identify climate exposure, transition needs in the portfolios of these financial institutions, and use the financial institutions to push change in the corporate sector. So that's very much, we think, part of what is needed. So if I start by If I start by China, so it's kind of obvious. I'll give you a first sketch of what the system is like, and then go into a little bit more detail of each of these mechanisms. So obviously the planning is a very important element, and here, of course, it's very important to have goals at the national level, at the provincial level. I can say at the beginning, it was really not like that. In the 2020, when this was announced, this was very much a goal at the federal level, and it had not been kind of thought through at the provincial level or below, or at the city level. That's since then been happening, and I think there has been a lot of progress on this. But it was also for a while these the two targets, as you talk about in China, the peaking target and the net zero target, they were not uniformly implemented, and particularly at the provincial level, for a long time, it was only the target of peaking that was being mentioned. But I would say today that this a lot has happened to make China have a more or less consistent planning mechanism. But I'll come back to that there are lots of issues in the planning, to inconsistencies and measures that have had to be changed to adjust to these new goals. When it comes to markets, China now has both national and regional emissions trading systems, carbon markets, and they from having initially just the power sector, it has now the national ETS has been expanded to include steel, cement, and sorry, twice steel, but and aluminum. Financial governance, the PBOC, the central bank, has introduced multiple green finance tools and has really been at the forefront, I would say, of climate finance thinking, not only in China but also globally. We've been very much active in the international debate. Has co-chaired, for example, the Sustainable Finance Working Group of the G20 and so on. So it's a sophisticated institution when it comes to financial governance. The person who was sort of the godfather of our discussions with the Chinese authorities was the former governor of the PBOC, Governor Zhou, and his concern was that there was not enough emphasis on the use of the financial system. He was also very concerned that the market system was not giving sufficiently strong signal and the right signals throughout the economy. So that the planning system was somehow too powerful and too effective, and also had some distortions that he was concerned about. So and I think that's very close to the view that we came out with when we were thinking through the Chinese system. And of course, what plays a very important role in China are the large state-owned enterprises and the sort of infrastructure investment and management, and that was something that absolutely needed to be integrated into these Chinese plans. So now I think I've said most of what I have to say now on the sort of overall picture of China, but just say a little bit more about the planning mechanism, because it was quite clear to us, and it became clearer as we were talking to different Chinese entities during this work. And you remember, this was in COVID. It was very difficult to even visit Chinese government entities and so on. So there was really a sign of their willingness and eagerness to engage on this topic, that we were allowed to visit some of the key government institutions. For me, it was a fantastic opportunity to really get inside the Chinese planning machine and see, the kind of challenges they faced as they were trying to make sense of these policies and implement them. But as you know, they have these 5-year plans, and the next 5-year plan will be very important for taking the net zero transition to the next level. And you probably would have seen that the evidence suggests that China already has peaked before 2030. One has to be a little bit careful there, because I think some of this data now reflects that the Chinese economy is not operating at full steam, if you want. It's some of this is reflecting the relatively low level of economic activity. So I wouldn't celebrate this too much, but at least it's a good sign that it seems like last year the carbon footprint of China reduced a little bit, despite this increase in coal-fired power plants, for example. They have really overperformed on the renewable side, as you probably all know. There's a lot to say about how they operate the planning system, but one big problem was that they didn't, the way that they thought about the energy transition was very much focused on energy efficiency and not on focusing on the carbon footprint, and that had to be changed, and that has now been changed. There were things like that. So in the planning system, and particularly if the planning system dominates so strongly as it does in China, not leaving apart that they also have, of course, a very active and very competitive private sector, the planning system is very powerful, and particularly in this space, it plays a very important role. But if you then have these kind of distortions in the system, that can sort of amplify the challenges you are facing. So I probably that's all I'm going to say about the planning part. I say a little bit now about the market part. It's and we're here. It's still very much a system in evolution. They've had for quite some time now. I forget exactly when the first regional trading system was implemented, but that they did this in, I think, 7 or 8 different regional markets. They're all slightly different, and so you can actually compare them and learn from them. So it's a kind of very typical Chinese way of going about things. So they kind of experimented with different models, different coverage, different types of markets, and until then in 2021 they implemented a national ETS, and of course it became very quickly very big, the second biggest in the world. When you look at the record now, a few years later, it's been not very liquid. Most of the trading is around these compliance dates. You don't learn very much by looking at so the data. But I think, to be fair, they have learned quite a bit themselves about what can be done easily, what is more difficult. Also among different companies, they know more about the situation. So I think that's going to affect how China moves forward on the market mechanism, and most likely, as I come back to later, where they will move from now, which is a kind of rate-based system, to a cap and trade system, in the new 5-year plan. But it's really been sort of a learning by doing, and we can show that these pilots, and we have done some work on that actually, that these pilots did affect both the carbon footprint of the enterprises involved. They also affected in these provinces. They affected the import of green technologies. There seemed to be really no sort of spillovers, in the sense that less or more carbon intensive industries moved from that province to other provinces. That doesn't seem to be the case. So it seems like, with all the reservations about the size of the market, the liquidity of the market, it hasn't. They have been useful, and they are still very much evolving. So the third element of the Chinese model is the financial governance, and as I said, China has really been part of the vanguard. I would say they were part of, already from the beginning, internationally. They were part of the Network for the Greening of the Financial System, which is a network of central banks it probably has now more than 90 members, I think, and they also worked very intensely with the EU to kind of have a harmonization of the basic taxonomy. They have so most of the tools that you think of as sort of green monetary policy and green sort of financial governance, I think that they have them. They were not fully employed yet, but they are quite advanced in this, and they're now taking this to nature, to both to sort of water management, and to other aspects that also have often are linked to climate. So let me. This is all I was going to say now at this level about China, and just coming very quickly to India. Obviously India is at a much lower level of per capita emissions, but both because of the way the Indian economy is developing, but also because of demographics, that India still has several decades of sort of this second demographic transition. So India is already the largest country in the world, but it will continue to grow, and will, for both those reasons, continue to increase its carbon footprint. I would say overall the transition there has been more market driven, and it's particularly in the renewable energy space. So I would say that almost everything that's happened in that space in terms of actual investment has been in the private sector. And while sort of the fossil fuel part of the economy is still very much influenced by state ownership. So both the main actors in the fossil fuel sector are state-owned, but also the financial institutions funding or financing the fossil fuel sector are state-owned. So there's quite a need to bring in to this state-owned sector more incentives to drive the renewables sector and decarbonize. Carbon markets and green finance, they are still very much nascent. There is an agreement to build carbon markets, but they haven't really gotten going on this. What's critical in India is that most of the investments and like the AIB, we work with state entities. So obviously we have relationship at the federal level, but we work with individual states, and that's where all the investments decisions lie. The challenge there is that the institutional strength and state capacity vary a lot across states, and India is almost the reverse of China, where in China about 70% of state officials are at the province level and below, while in India it's the opposite. So 70% are at the federal level. So you have a much weaker capacity in general at the state level. I would say also that the central bank, the RBI, has started to incorporate risk, but it's still slower than what I described for PBOC. Having said that, I mean, I think there is a lot of willingness and engagement in the RBI, but they're lagging. And what India needs, other than different from China, India needs massive transfers of technology and accompanying that a lot of foreign capital. And I think that is perhaps the main challenge for India, that it cannot do this on its own. And of course, that's the challenge for almost all emerging and developing economies, other than those that have very large natural resources, perhaps. But really, this is the main challenge. How do we organize these? We talk about these sort of country platforms that can both coordinate international development partners, but also participate in mobilizing resources domestically. That is the number one challenge, I would say, for India. Yeah. So about planning in India, it's a federal structure. There's a lot of heterogeneity in planning across different states and across different sectors. The central government clearly sets direction, but implementation relies on a lot on the states. India has set long-term ambitions. It announced, as you probably remember, through Modi in Glasgow, and to reach net zero by 2070. But a bit like when China announced its objectives, this hadn't really been worked out very carefully, neither within the federal government, but also with the states. So India still doesn't really have a sort of unified and detailed and decentralized roadmap for this process. Climate strategy tends to be around a set of missions. So they are all quite good and powerful, but they don't really amount to a full program, I would say. Very importantly, though, that there are very powerful and strong civil society organizations and relatively strong academic contributions to this. So then we used that when we worked with our India study. There was very much a collaboration with two, in particular, think tanks that I think, have very deep knowledge in the climate space generally, but particularly in India, of course. We also worked closely with the government think tank, the Niti Aayog, and they have also built over time a much stronger capacity to think about climate policy. Probably don't want to say too much about the market mechanisms. There's a lot of emphasis on competition, private sector participation in clean energy, as I mentioned. They've had this perform, achieve, trade, which is a sort of market-based mechanism for achieving energy efficiency. The national carbon market is under development. As I said, the main role of the markets have been to promote the renewable sector, and a lot has happened there in India, no doubt. But there's still the challenge of building compatible transmission systems and policies that support the renewable sector. Carbon pricing is still very much evolving, and it has a lot of political sensitivities in India. Probably don't say too much about the financial governance. It's still very much evolving. RBI joined this NGFS in 2021. They really want to attract international climate finance, and they need it, but I think the basic framework for doing that is not in place yet. So that will be an important objective, as I said, for India to meet. I think that it's work in progress. Some good things have been achieved. There's much more thinking about this in our RBI now than when we first started working with them about 2 or 3 years ago. So let me now take a step back and look very quickly at the different pillars. So I think pillar 1 on planning, need integrated national strategies. You need very much multi-stakeholder collaboration, where you need to think about reducing carbon footprint, but you also need resilience and adaptation. Of course, a place like India in particular, the adaptation and resilience part is very, very important. On pillar 2, markets, it's carbon pricing and market mechanisms needs work both in China and India. Green financial products, China has come somewhat further than India, but it is still not fully developed for sure. Risk mitigation instruments, I think in both countries, still very, very much need. The innovation ecosystems have been, I think, remarkable in China, and they are also quite flourishing, particularly in the sort of IT space in India. Financial governance, regulatory frameworks, having scenarios for net zero transition, very important. Integrating this into public financial management, building capacity. So we are running now, for example, a program together with LSE and Stanford, actually, and Tsinghua University on building capacity in finance ministries to better manage this process. That's quite important. And obviously, international cooperation has been very important for China, and we very much hope that China will stay engaged in the international conversation, because it's critical for their own thinking and, of course, for learning from the Chinese experience. So these 3 pillars, they are really mutually reinforcing. So, if you have effective planning that really enables markets to function efficiently, robust financial governments gives you transparent and accountable resource allocation. But you can also have, excessive planning, and some examples of that in China. It can really distort market signals and resource allocation. And depending too much on one mechanism may amplify um, the weaknesses of that mechanism. So as I mentioned, planning in China, maybe because it's so powerful and because it has some inbuilt-in distortions, you need to really address those distortions. I have spoken a lot about state capacity. I don't think I need to say much more about that now, but it cuts across a lot of different aspects of the state. Maybe just a word on what is it really that we want from state capacity? We want state capacity that allows you to credibly commit to strategies. I think thinking about India, if India is going to credibly attract, or if it's going to attract the kind of financial resources it needs from its international development partners, it really needs to build credibility around its net zero framework, and that, I think, carbon pricing is a very important part of that, and of course reducing fossil fuel subsidies. So credibility is a very important part of what state capacity can enable. And then you have the whole issue of coordination across different government entities, between different levels of government, and so on. Also, where state capacity becomes very important. And then having some sort of pools of experts or centers of excellence that can really help you select among technologies, because of course you want the very good technology, but you want also very appropriate technology. So there it's important to understand, how different technologies operate in your particular system and your particular economic context. So these are kind of three aspects of state capacity, and I think you cannot think about the net zero transition without thinking through what is the state capacity. So let me try to summarize what I've said here, that when you think about the net zero process from emerging and developing economy perspective, the first thing is you need really to tailor this to state capacity, to use the levers that you have. Often these states are not so overall very powerful, but they do have state ownerships. The SOEs are, in almost all developing and emerging economies, and particularly in Asia, but also in most other emerging developing economies, are very important. So if you can start exercising the governance that as at least implied in these state-owned enterprises, that could be a very important tool. The same thing with state-owned banks. And of course, building capacity is going to be a very important part of this. And strengthening this coordination mechanism, and I use this term country platforms, and that these platforms need to be country owned, and that's going to be particularly important in India, which does not take well to foreign interference. So it really has to come from within, building this platform, and the platform, as I said, is both about integrating your international development partners, but also about mobilizing capital domestically. And this will never be successful if we don't manage to mobilize more resources domestically. This is true. There's really no development process globally that has not relied on domestic resource mobilization. Maybe some oil or petro states, but for the rest, it's all been about, to a considerable degree, about mobilizing domestic resources, and that these country platforms can be very important for that. We need to try to do whatever we can to have net zero planning and integrate them with development goals. So I think this is often the weakest point in many economies, including many advanced economies, by the way. So I think that we need that net zero planning integrated into the overall development and industrial policies. leverage market mechanisms for efficiency, so really use markets and of course think about the distribution consequences, but really try to make markets work. Use strong financial governance, reducing the financial system, the financial regulation, and to drive change at the corporate level. And again, no single lever is sufficient. You need to monitor, learn, and adapt over time. Identify where they support each other, where they maybe counteract, and when one dominates and others are weaker, and so on. That's something you need to learn over time. And obviously engage with stakeholders, think about the distribution consequences. It was very important for us when we did this work that we very much worked with local institutions. We had their sensitivities. They ultimately owned these reports that we have been working on. That I think is the only way forward, particularly in countries like China and India. I don't want to say. I mean, obviously, you can start thinking about different kinds of emerging and developing economies. I don't think in too much. We can come back to that, but there are of course important differences. I've treated them now as one, and you can see already from the differences between China and India that there's a very wide spectrum that we are covering. So what can development banks like AIIB do? Well, as I said, we have just started to do policy-based lending for climate, and it's been a very, very interesting, particularly for me as an economist and for my colleagues in the economics department, because it gives us a more important role in thinking through what should be done and not. So we need to work very more than we do today in an integrated way across projects and sectors, and we need to engage with state-owned enterprises, state-owned financial institutions. We need to become even better at crowding in the private sector. We need to develop capacity to help build state capacity. We should think of, in my view, we should think really of state capacity as part of infrastructure in a way that when we are selling or facilitating lending to allow countries to import renewable technology, for example, we should also try to transfer knowledge about how to make these renewables work with other infrastructure, how to make it, what regulatory framework you need, encourage lessons learned from different countries where we operate. We need to support green technology transition or technology transfer. Infrastructure sector. I didn't know this when I joined the bank, but I've become acutely aware of it, that these infrastructure companies or construction industry in particular is actually quite slow in integrating new technology, the slowest sector, arguably, among all the major sectors of the economy. So playing a role there in trying to match traditional infrastructure companies with these new technologies, new startups, and so on, is a very important thing, and something I'm sure in Stanford you have a lot of experience to convey. And we need to support, government efforts to build state capacity and promote technology adoption. This is, so we are very active part of many of these country platforms that are emerging in different countries. And if you want, we can maybe come into how this is working. But this is all I want to say now. Thank you very much for listening, and sorry to run through so many slides and so much text, but that was the best I could do, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think when you do this kind of rich comparative analysis, it's impossible not to have to deal with the text. It's just the nature of the analysis. And reflecting on your comment at the end there about the need to think about state capacity, building state capacity itself as a kind of infrastructure project. And that comment having come on the heels of some of your other analysis of the stakeholder engagement and the need for sort of just transition to be attended to within climate and development policy. Are there engagement challenges that you observed in your case study analysis in these two countries that link engagement to the creation of these sort of bespoke country platforms, or as you might say, the project of building state capacity? Or do you think more about civil society engagement in terms of sort of getting consultation and input on the appropriate distribution of impacts once you have strong planning capacities in place? I wonder if you could just say a little bit about whether you see a link between.
There are terms we use here that are a little bit superficial in a way, but they are or slogans, but they are actually quite profound, I think, when you actually work on this. So we talk about country ownership, and we use it very loosely, I guess. But when you work in a country like India, for example, I mean in China also for sure, but India, there's a whole history of very kind of insensitive attempts to impose policies on India, and even when we started, I say we, but the global community started to engage with the Indian government on the net zero process through these G7-driven jet peace. I don't know if you've come across this term, but it's most of you who work in the space would have heard about these joint energy transition programs and or just energy transition program, I think they eventually were called, and these were initiatives for two G7 countries identified an emerging and developing economy and wanted to work with them. And so South Africa had this. There was some attempts in Vietnam and some in Indonesia. There was also an attempt to engage with the Indian government, but Indian government just didn't want to have any. There was the US and Germany were supposed to do this, and it just didn't work. And it was, I think, partly because of just deep sensitivities in India, but also the fact that you need to work with local institutions. You need to have their buy-in. You need to listen to what they have in mind and where they see sensitivities and pressure points and so on. And I think that, and I can, so many times over the work on this Indian case study that we run into these kinds of sensitivities. Even in when we were trying to write this comparative paper. So the reason why we wrote this comparative paper was that we are now working on Brazil, and we wanted to look at the Chinese and Indian experience and see what are the lessons for Brazil. And that was something that the Brazilians were very interested in, and it was maybe one of the reasons that the government asked us to do this. And this even for an Indian to be put into this comparative framework with China is sensitive in itself. So I'm saying maybe it's, some vague things here, but it's really just the reality that if we don't take into account these sensitivities, if we don't really engage with local stakeholders in shaping these kind of documents, and then ultimately shaping these institutional processes, and so we will never succeed. And I hope that AIB, by being owned the way it's owned and by having India as its largest client, have developed some of capacity to have these sensitive conversations. But it's not easy, and there are different parts of the Indian government that are more or less sensitive and are more or less willing to engage. And so yes, and so I probably didn't answer your question directly, but I think the process is, I would say, I said that in my initial point, I view this as a process, writing these papers, where the process is more important than the final outcome in a way. And I think I need to think about these things as processes. And we economists have not always been so good at thinking about process, unfortunately.
Yes, the politics can be, as you'd say, sort of a non-starter for even getting
Yeah.
these initiatives going. So Young, I see your hand up, and then afterwards we'll go to one final question in the chat.
Yeah, hello, Eric. Thank you again for presenting with us. And then it's actually, I am very excited to be the first audience of your latest paper. This is amazing. So Young-in, I'm a faculty member at KAIST and also leading this seminar series with the Stanford SFI. I think throughout your talk, I think the coordination is a key word, one of the keywords that you highlighted. Then my question is, when you see that, some countries, maybe some Western countries that are more like market-led countries, how does coordination happen? Were they similar or were they explicitly different? That's my first question. And then now that I am in Asian countries, and then what I am seeing is, those governments are actually having those, like options in their hands. And then also they know who should move in individual segment, but the coordination is hard. So like, like when they try to start something, then everyone is pointing out to the other segment that, if that starts, then I can start. That type of thing requires like a really heavy coordination. And then I think, especially in the Asian countries, like a coordination power done by the, like governments are very important. Then would you have any advice to those, government who are hesitating and or catalyzing this type of coordination, like a wider coordination, where to start and, like what to consider?
Where I thought a bit more about this is in this notion of country platforms. For those of you who are in this field or in this space, you know that basically since 2018 and when this report by the D20 on the Eminent Persons Group on global financial governance, they first put forward this notion of country platforms. The very first thing was that the World Bank announced that they were running 16 pilots on country platforms. And when I went to countries that were supposed to be part of this piloting, they had no idea what this was about. So, I think there is this process of coordination that these country platforms were supposed to achieve has to come from within. And I think that's the sort of second generation of country platforms, the ones that, for example, Egypt, which took a sector, renewables, and so they focused on energy transition. So they took renewables, they put all the renewable projects they had over the next 10 years on a platform, and for everyone to see, for the multilateral development banks, the other development finance institutions, for the private sector to see, what role do you want to play in making these happen. And then they received funding from the US government, not very likely to happen with the new or the current US government, but they got a lot of funding for decommissioning fossil fuel assets, retraining staff, some early retirement, and so on. And then they also got from the German government a what do you call it, performance-linked debt instrument. So by ratcheting up their commitments under the Paris Agreement, if they achieve that, they would get a certain interest rate, and if they didn't, they will get a higher interest rate for that loan. So that's something that allowed the Egyptian government to credibly commit to implement a set of policies in the energy sector, and lowered probably their financing costs for doing so. And so there, I think, were coordination, and it started. So they have this expression, NUEFI. So that's is water, food, and energy, and it's a nexus of water, food, and energy. So that's where they focused, and of course now they need to start thinking about other things like monetary policy, like fiscal policy. They have an issue with too much dollar or euro finance, not enough local currency financing, for example. So they need to think about, bringing in other parts of the government, other parts of policy into this coordination. There may be the third generation of country platforms. I would say Brazil is there. It hasn't been tested so much yet, but that's a country platform that really takes a starting point in this what do you call it, eco transformational program that they have adopted for the whole economy, and there you can see, a lot of ambition to really bring this coordination about. But it's a very difficult, and we know it's not easy, even in advanced country like the US, to achieve this. And probably, when I talk to American colleagues, they feel like that the planning component is very weak in the US system, and we have a lot of improvements needed to be made there to really believe that we can achieve the net zero objectives. If this is still a goal of the US government, is of course open to question. You said there was something in
Yes.
the talk as well?
We are at time, but I'll go ahead and pose this last question. If people have to leave, that's fine, but I will just read this quickly from the chat. Given recent focus on China's domination and controlling critical rare earth elements that are important for the energy transition, what do you see as an appropriate framework to deal with the supply issues so that geopolitics does not become one of the biggest obstacles towards net zero transition or net zero systems?
Yeah, first of all, I think it is undoubtedly one of the major threats to achieving the net zero target. So I mean, geopolitics in general, and I think it's not just about rare earth, but it's about many of the things that we want to happen in these global value chains. For example, I think I would argue that these are perhaps the most effective means of achieving decarbonization, particularly across different countries and so on. So if we could work with these lead firms in global value chains, that would be fantastic opportunities, and for countries to offer opportunities to decarbonize in order to get into these global value chains. That's also a very strong driving force for them. So with the rare earths, obviously, it's very important for as you said, for a lot of the green technologies and for keeping up the sort of production line of this. I mean, the only thing I can say is that, I certainly would hope that this opens up and that it does not become drawn into these different trade policy initiatives. At the same time, you have to understand that countries are using the levers they have to try to influence the outcomes of these kind of situations. So, geopolitics can create a lot of issues for the net zero transition, for sure, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that there are these domestic processes that can continue this pressure, even though some of these international exchanges of technologies and capital are disrupted by these policies.
Thank you, Eric. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. So everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Berglof for joining us today. We're really fortunate to have gotten this first glimpse, as So Young said, at a very rich and important paper. So thank you again, Eric. And this video will be up, this recording will be up in SFI's video library, so people can watch it there. And enjoy the rest of your day, everyone, whatever time zone you are. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.